In 1800, a barefoot man crossed Ohio carrying nothing but apple seeds in a sack on his back. Johnny Appleseed was not planting fruit for fun. Frontier families needed that cider to survive the winter because clean water killed as often as cold did. What started in the mountains of Kazakhstan 4,000 years earlier had become the backbone of an entire civilization by then. But here is what shocks most people. Over 10,000 apple varieties once existed, and nearly all of them have vanished from the earth. Number 14 on this list reveals the one variety that secretly built early America. Drop the name of your favorite apple below right now. The answer coming up at number 7 will completely change how you see it. Number 20. The wild beginning. Kazakhstan, 4,000 years ago, there was no orchard. No farmer had planted anything deliberately. Deep inside the Tian Shan mountain range, wild apple trees called Malus sieversii grew so thick and heavy with fruit that the ground beneath them stayed permanently stained red and gold through harvest season. Bears ate from those trees. Wild horses crushed the fruit beneath their hooves. Birds carried seeds for miles in their stomachs. This was not a cultivated crop. This was nature doing something extraordinary entirely on its own. Scientists who traced apple DNA back to its origin in the 20th century discovered that every single apple eaten anywhere on Earth today, every Red Delicious, every Granny Smith, every Honeycrisp, traces its genetic ancestry back to those original wild trees in the mountains of Central Asia. That forest is still there. Most people will never hear its name. But the apple did not stay in Kazakhstan, and the way it traveled changes everything. Number 19. The Silk Road carried more than silk. When ancient traders loaded their camels and began moving goods between China, Persia, and the Mediterranean world, they carried spices, fabrics, and metals. They also carried apple seeds, pressed into the mud on wagon wheels and tucked inside the stomachs of pack animals. By the time those routes reached Greece, cultivated apple varieties already existed in Persia, and Greek farmers had begun grafting branches onto rootstocks to reproduce the best trees they had found. Alexander the Great reportedly encountered dwarf apple trees in Persia around 328 BC and sent samples back to his teacher, Aristotle. Whether that detail is entirely precise or slightly embellished by history, the broader truth holds. By the time Greek civilization peaked, the apple had already crossed half the known world without any single human making a deliberate plan to move it. Number 18. Rome built orchards before it built roads. Roman agriculturalists were obsessed with improving crops, and apples became one of their most documented projects. By the 1st century AD, Roman writers had recorded over 20 distinct cultivated varieties. Pliny the Elder listed them in his encyclopedic work on natural history, describing flavors and textures the way a modern food critic would. Roman legions planted apple orchards as they conquered territory, not for sentiment, but for practical supply. A marching army needed food that could survive transport, and dried apples kept for months without spoiling. Wherever Rome expanded, into Britain, into France, into Germany, apple orchards followed. When the empire eventually collapsed, those orchards remained. They became the agricultural foundation that kept European populations alive through centuries that came after. Here is the first pattern break. Everything so far sounds like simple agriculture. Seeds moving, trees growing, armies eating. But apple cultivation was never just about food. It was about power. The ability to grow, store, and distribute apples through long winters meant the difference between a population that survived and one that didn't. Whoever controlled the orchards controlled the food supply. Whoever controlled the food supply controlled the territory. This fruit was a political weapon for centuries before anyone called it that. Number 17. The medieval monastery orchardist. After Rome fell, the people who kept apple cultivation alive were monks. Benedictine monasteries across France, Germany, and England maintained orchards with a religious discipline that matched their devotion to scripture. Monks recorded grafting techniques. They tracked which varieties produced best in which soil. They stored apples in cold cellars built specifically to extend the fruit's life through winter. By the early medieval period, monasteries had become the primary source of both table apples and cider production across Western Europe. This was not charity. Cider was currency. Monasteries sold it, taxed peasants with it, and used it to fund construction that lasted centuries. The stone cathedrals of medieval Europe were built in part on apple orchard revenue. That is not metaphor. That is economic history. Number 16. Cider was the water of the old world. This requires a full stop to understand properly. Before the germ theory of disease, before anyone understood why drinking untreated river water made people violently ill, cider was the safe alternative. The fermentation process killed bacteria that water couldn't. In England by the 17th century, farm laborers received cider as part of their daily wages, often 4 to 8 pints per day. Children drank it. Elderly people drank it. It was not about getting drunk. It was about staying alive. When English colonists crossed the Atlantic to America, they brought apple seeds because they knew exactly what their survival depended on. Water in the New World was just as dangerous as water in the Old World, and they intended to brew their way through the problem. Number 15. The Pilgrims' first winter and the missing orchards. Here is the part nobody tells you. The colonists who arrived in New England in the early 1600s had almost nothing to eat through their first winters because they had not yet grown apple trees. It took years for planted orchards to mature. The death toll in early settlements was catastrophic partly for this reason. Cider production required trees that were at minimum 4 to 6 years old before they produced enough fruit to press. Every settlement that survived long enough to establish an orchard had a dramatically better survival rate than one that didn't. This single agricultural fact shaped which early American settlements thrived and which ones quietly disappeared from the historical record. Number 14. Johnny Appleseed was not a fairy tale. He was a businessman. John Chapman, born in 1774 in Massachusetts, understood something that pure romantic mythology stripped away from his story. Apple trees grown from seed produce unpredictable fruit, most of it too bitter and sour to eat raw. But every single one of those trees produced apples that could be pressed into hard cider, and hard cider was what frontier families needed desperately to survive Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois winters. Chapman moved ahead of westward expansion deliberately, planting nurseries and then selling the saplings to arriving settlers who needed them urgently. He was not wandering barefoot out of whimsy. He was filling a supply chain before the demand arrived. By the time he died in 1845, he had covered an area of roughly 100,000 square miles with apple nurseries. The legend grew. The business strategy behind it quietly faded from memory. Pattern break. Notice what just happened across the last 5 items. The apple was not a luxury. It was not decoration. It was infrastructure. Every civilization that advanced from hunter-gatherer survival to something more complex did so partly on the back of preserved food, and for over 2,000 years across 2 hemispheres, apple cider and dried apples were among the most reliable preserved foods available. The history of apple growing is the history of human survival during winter. That is the frame that everything else in this list has to be understood through. Number 13. The grafting secret that changed everything. Here is a biological fact that apple growers figured out very early. Every apple grown from seed is genetically unique. If you take seeds from the best apple you have ever tasted and plant them, the trees that grow will produce completely different fruit, often inferior. The only way to reproduce a specific apple variety reliably is to cut a branch from the original tree and graft it onto a different rootstock. This technique, grafting, was known in ancient Persia and Greece, and it meant that every named apple variety that ever existed had to be maintained through an unbroken chain of human hands cutting and grafting, generation after generation, century after century. If that chain broke even once, the variety was gone. Permanently. This is why thousands of apple varieties have vanished. Not because people stopped wanting them, because someone, somewhere, stopped maintaining the tree. Number 12. The Pomme de Paris and the French obsession. By the 17th and 18th centuries, French horticulturalists had elevated apple cultivation into something approaching art. The royal gardens at Versailles under Louis XIV maintained hundreds of apple varieties. Jean-Baptiste de la Quintanille, the head gardener to the king, documented grafting and pruning techniques that European growers still reference today. French varieties developed during this period. Varieties with names like Colville Blanc de Hiver were considered so refined that their flavor and texture were compared directly to wine. The apple had moved from frontier survival food to aristocratic table decoration, and that shift in class association followed it all the way into the 20th century, when certain varieties became expensive boutique items while others stayed anonymous grocery store staples. Number 11. Newton's apple. What the story gets wrong. Isaac Newton did not discover gravity because an apple fell on his head. That version of the story is simplified almost to the point of fiction. What is documented is that Newton himself, late in his life, described sitting in a garden and watching an apple fall from a tree, which prompted him to wonder why objects always fell straight down rather than sideways or upward. The apple was a catalyst for a question, not a magic trigger for a completed theory. Gravity as a concept took Newton years of calculation after that moment. The reason the apple fall story survived and spread so completely is that it makes a complex mathematical discovery feel like an accident of nature rather than decades of disciplined mental work. Apples have always been symbols for things humans find difficult to explain. Number 10. The Great American Apple Boom of the 1800s. By the mid-19th century, apple growing had become one of the most profitable agricultural industries in the United States. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, allowed New York apple farmers to ship barrels of fruit and cider to markets that had never had access before. Upstate New York, Ohio, and Virginia became orchard country, producing varieties with names most people today have never heard: Newtown Pippin, Northern Spy, Roxbury Russet, Baldwin. These were not decorative varieties. They were working apples, built for storage, for pressing, for winter meals, and for long journeys on wagons and boats. The Baldwin apple dominated New England markets for over a century before a brutal winter in 1933-34 killed most of the old orchards, and the variety never fully recovered. An entire commercial ecosystem built over 100 years was nearly erased by one cold season. Number 9. Prohibition killed the American apple. Here is what the temperance movement almost destroyed entirely. When Prohibition arrived in 1920 and alcohol production became illegal, federal agents targeted apple orchards aggressively. Hard cider had been America's default alcoholic drink for 3 centuries, and cider production required apple trees that produced bitter, tannic, astringent fruit, not the sweet varieties suitable for eating. When cider became illegal, there was no market left for those bitter varieties, and farmers cut down thousands of acres of old orchards and replanted with sweet-eating apples instead. Thousands of cider apple varieties, built up over generations, maintained through careful grafting chains, were destroyed within a decade. When Prohibition ended in 1933, the knowledge of how to grow and press those old varieties had largely died along with the trees. American craft cider culture is only now, a century later, trying to reconstruct what was lost. Pattern break. 3 times in this list, something external. Empire collapse, a single brutal winter, federal law, nearly erased what had taken centuries to build. The fragility of apple diversity is not just an agricultural problem. It is a cultural one. Every variety that disappears takes with it a specific flavor, a specific history, and a specific human relationship with a particular place and season. What is being lost is not just a fruit. It is memory in biological form. Number 8. The rise of the red delicious and its fall. In 1872, a farmer in Iowa named Jesse Hyatt noticed a seedling growing in his orchard that he did not plant. He cut it down twice. It grew back. The third time, he let it grow, and when it finally fruited, he tasted something remarkable, a deep red apple with a flavor sweet enough to seem almost improbable. He named it the Hawkeye and entered it in a competition where a nursery owner named Clarence Stark tasted it and reportedly said, "Delicious, delicious." Stark bought the rights, renamed it Red Delicious, and began selling it across the country. Within decades, commercial growers had bred the Red Delicious not for flavor, but for appearance. Deeper red color, longer shelf life, tougher skin. The flavor was gradually bred out of it across the 20th century. By the 1990s, Red Delicious was the most grown apple in the United States and widely considered by food writers to be among the worst-tasting ones available. It is a perfect case study in what happens when a food system optimizes for appearance over taste. Number 7. The forgotten flavors. 10,000 varieties, 5 in stores. Before industrial agriculture standardized grocery supply chains, American farmers grew an almost incomprehensible diversity of apple varieties. A 1905 USDA report cataloged over 14,000 named apple varieties being grown in the United States alone. Today, 5 varieties account for roughly 70% of commercial apple production in the country. The rest, varieties with names like Esopus Spitzenbug, Cox's Orange Pippin, and Ashmead's Kernel, survive only in heritage orchards maintained by enthusiasts and agricultural historians. Ashmead's Kernel, first recorded in England around 1700, produces a fruit described consistently as tasting like pear drops dissolved in apple juice, with a depth of flavor that supermarket apples never approach. It is available almost nowhere commercially. This is not because it is difficult to grow. It is because it does not ship well, does not photograph well, and does not fit the standardized sizing requirements of large grocery chains. A fruit that survived 3 centuries of human cultivation has been made commercially invisible by a box. Number 6. The apple in war. Armies have relied on apples in ways military history rarely emphasizes. During the American Civil War, the Union Army shipped dried apple slices by the barrel as a standard ration component. Dried apples provided vitamin C, prevented scurvy, and were compact enough to travel with infantry over long distances. During World War I, soldiers in the trenches received apple rations as a comfort item alongside their standard issue food. The British Army's apple distribution networks during the Second World War are documented in logistical records that read like orchard inventories. This was not sentiment. Military planners understood that morale and nutrition were interconnected, and that a familiar, storable fruit addressed both problems at once. Number 5. Johnny Appleseed's trees are still out there. In 2019, a single apple tree was discovered in Nova Scotia that researchers traced through historical records to a grafting lineage that went back to the early 1800s. There are verified old trees in Ohio and Indiana that date to the period when Chapman was planting nurseries. These are not tourist attractions. They stand in fields and overgrown lots, unremarked, unphotographed. The fruit they produce is usually not edible raw, bitter, small, dense. But the cider pressed from some of those old trees carries flavors that commercial varieties cannot approximate. A handful of heritage cider makers have begun tracking these trees and pressing small batch ciders from their fruit, preserving in liquid form what would otherwise vanish entirely when the trees die. Number 4. The apple as symbol, what it has represented across cultures. Few fruits carry symbolic weight as consistently as the apple across recorded human culture. The Norse myth of Idun tells of a goddess who kept golden apples that gave the gods immortality. Greek mythology used golden apples as prizes in contests between heroes. The apple in the biblical Garden of Eden, which the original Hebrew text identifies only as fruit, never specifically an apple, became fixed in Western imagination as an apple through early Latin translations and medieval European art. In Chinese culture, the word for apple shares phonetic similarity with the word for peace, making it a common gift. In Celtic tradition, the island paradise of the afterlife was called Avalon, a name derived from the old word for apple. Across dozens of unconnected cultures, on every continent where apples grew, this fruit became the symbol for knowledge, temptation, immortality, and the transition between the mortal world and something beyond it. That is not coincidence. That is a fruit that grew close enough to human settlements, for long enough, to embed itself into the symbolic grammar of entire civilizations. Number 3. The science hidden inside an apple. An apple contains between 80 and 100 milligrams of polyphenol per 100 grams of fruit, compounds that function as antioxidants in human biology. The phrase, "an apple a day keeps the doctor away," originated in 19th century Welsh folk medicine and was recorded in print as early as 1866. The underlying observation that regular apple consumption correlated with better health outcomes in populations that ate them preceded the biochemistry that would eventually explain it by almost a century. Modern nutritional research has documented that the combination of fiber, quercetin, and other compounds in apples has measurable effects on cardiovascular health, gut microbiome diversity, and blood sugar regulation. Number 2. The disappearing orchard. Why old varieties are going extinct. Every decade, agricultural heritage organizations document apple varieties that have vanished from the living record. A variety goes extinct not with a single dramatic event, but through slow attrition, one tree dies, no grafting record exists, no surviving branch was ever taken. The Pomme Grise, a Quebec variety once common across French-Canadian farmsteads, nearly disappeared entirely before enthusiasts tracked down surviving trees in the 1980s and restarted its propagation. The brown snout, an English cider apple documented in the 1800s, is considered functionally extinct. There are others with no surviving trees at all, known only through written descriptions in old agricultural journals. Flavors no living person has tasted, textures no existing apple approximates. When a variety goes, its genome goes with it, taking genetic information that plant breeders might have used to develop disease-resistant or climate-adapted trees in the future. The stakes of apple extinction are not sentimental. They are practical and permanent. Number 1. The apple's next chapter, and the threat nobody sees coming. Apple scab, fire blight, and woolly apple aphid have plagued orchards for centuries. But the emerging threat now is climate change reshaping the precise temperature conditions that apple trees need to produce fruit reliably. Many traditional apple varieties require a specific number of cold winter hours, a chilling requirement, to break dormancy and bloom correctly in spring. As winters warm, regions that have grown apples for centuries are becoming unreliable for certain varieties. Parts of England, France, and New England are already seeing reduced yields from old heritage varieties that cannot adapt. Plant breeders are working urgently to develop low-chill varieties that can survive warmer winters. But every year of delay means more old orchards becoming less productive and more growers switching to the handful of commercial varieties that survive shipping over flavor. The 10,000-year story of the apple is entering a chapter that nobody planned for, and most people eating an apple today have no idea it is happening. 10,000 varieties. For 1,000 years, armies, monks, frontier families, and barefoot nurserymen all depending on the same fruit to get through one more winter. The apple didn't just feed civilizations, it quietly built them, financed them, and in some cases saved them from collapse. But here is what nobody in any of this history ever had to worry about: waking up to find that the fruit had simply become too uniform, too standardized, too corporate to carry that weight anymore. The next video reveals exactly which of those 10,000 lost varieties are being brought back right now, and where you can actually taste them. Drop the name of the variety that surprised you most from today in the comments. Then click that video, because what is being recovered right now is wilder than anything on this list.